And good afternoon. We're very pleased to have a double dose of authors at Google today. In fact, we have two books from the best-selling And Philosophy series. Our first speaker is Tyler Shores. Tyler Shores is no stranger to the Authors at Google program. In fact, he was one of the early founders and was involved for many years before he left to pursue a graduate degree in English literature from the University of Oxford. He's a frequent contributor to this Blackwell philosophy series, including Heroes in Philosophy, which he spoke with us a few years ago on the Authors at Google channel, and also Alice in Wonderland, and the very soon-to-be-released Arrested Development in Philosophy. That's it's Steve Holt. That's going to be awesome. He also taught a class on The Simpsons in philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley, so he's very, very in tune to the subject matter. He will be speaking to us today about the girl with the dragon tattoo and philosophy. So without further ado, we must go deeper.
All right. Thanks, Cliff. It is good to be back. And let's see, where do I start? Well, I read recently that the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is the most popular ebook, the best-selling ebook of all time. All time in a relative sense, because when we're talking about ebooks, we're not talking about that long. But that made me think. I do tend to read a lot of books on my Kindle now, and I was thinking the funny thing is, in a completely Kindle or Nook or Android tablet world, I probably never would have read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And the reason for that is I distinctly remember where I was when these books came on my radar. It was at the Denver airport at the Hudson Bookseller store. I mean, there's some people in this world, I guess, let me back up for a second. Some people notice the brand of shoes that other people wear. Some people notice other people can't help but stare at other people's babies. I'm that other type of person. I can't help but notice the type of books that other people read. So that kind of is what led me. That's my personal story to the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. In a world without the public visibility of book covers, you'd never know what people are reading, right? So it wasn't really the first person or the second person, but probably the third or fourth person I saw at that same airport who was reading The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, who was holding this book. And I finally said, okay, what's the deal with this book? What's so interesting about it? So that's really the point of this talk, is to kind of think about these questions, pose some questions, and to give some thought to what is it about The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo that's so interesting, and what's philosophically significant about it? On the one hand, I mean, these novels are what we might call a typical example of hard-boiled crime fiction. They're very much like, if you're a fan of the genre, Mickey Spillane or Raymond Chandler or Sue Grafton, like they're crime novels, they're detective novels. But on the other hand, I think there is something about the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo books that are fiction. They're fictions, but they're based on very non-fictional issues and themes. We know that the original title, the Swedish title of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, was Men Who Hate Women. And the reason for this title stems from an actual event that had a very serious effect on the author, upon Stieg Larsson. So I'm going to read a brief excerpt from a news article it'll give more context for this, I think. On that day, 15-year-old Stieg watched three friends rape a girl whose name was Lisbeth, who was the same age as him and someone he knew. Her screams were heartrending, but he didn't intervene. His loyalty to his friends was too strong. He was too young, too insecure. It was inevitable that he would realize afterwards that he could have acted and possibly prevented the rape. Haunted by feelings of guilt, he contacted the girl a few days later. When he begged her to forgive him for his cowardice and passivity, she told him bitterly that she could not accept his explanations. "I will never forgive you, ever," she said. So in some ways, the three books, the books in the series, are meant to be a survival story about a girl named Lisbeth, and it's a story about survival and justice and revenge. The three girl novels also have an uncompromising moral purpose. At the very end of the book, there's a very clear statement when one of the main characters says, and quote, "When it comes down to it, this story is not primarily about spies and secret government agencies. It's about violence against women and the men who enable it." So again, the question is, why are these books so popular? And I think I would start with the obvious, which is sex and violence. So let's talk about sex and violence for a second, because that is one of the things, it's one of the hallmarks, the markers of these kind of books, these popular fiction books. The message about sexual violence against women is clear. It's painfully clear. If you've read the books, some of the descriptions are brutal. And one of the most provocative chapters in the book that we wrote, The Girl with Dragon Tattoo and Philosophy, the question is raised, what effects does reading about these kind of books, these graphic depictions of sex and violence, have upon us, have upon like us as readers? Aristotle is one of our favorite ancient Greek philosophers. In the Poetics, he talks about the cathartic effect that these kind of descriptions have, these sort of graphic, violent images, that fear and pity are the primary undistilled emotions that we might feel. But it puts us in the shoes of these kind of vulnerable characters. And in that sense, I guess the point is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo isn't about senseless violence or pointless violence. It's about, in a larger sense, the social vulnerability of women, specifically abuse, psychological and sexual and physical, political abuse that happens against these, dependent people. So there is a larger political message that these thrilling crime novels are supposed to get to. And I think that is one of the things, that's one of the key things that makes The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo kind of a socially conscious popular fiction. So this idea of social, I don't know what to call it, moral consciousness is one of the main things that we discuss in our book, in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and Philosophy. There's a lot of interesting moral questions raised along the way, about the ethics of information, about revenge, about one of the things that I think we'd be interested here at Google is certainly how our identities are shaped, in an online age. That's something that comes up again and again with characters who are computer hackers, and to what extent do we control the identity that we have, and to what extent is it something that is kind of shaped by outside influences that we never see or hear about. So there's interesting themes here, and I think there's a lot of different questions that the book series deals with. And you might say that the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo books are popular, I think, because some of the larger themes of the book strike a chord with us. It's a crime novel, but because of the author's background, Stieg Larsson was a journalist and a crime reporter, it's meant to be as sort of an expose to it, an attempt to reveal the sort of moral bankruptcy of these people in power. Throughout the books, there's a certain sense of comeuppance for those people who get away with bad things. And more importantly, there's an examination, especially in the third book, The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest, the last book in the trilogy. It's about how society chooses to treat people it doesn't understand, and about how social labels are applied or misapplied, and what happens to those consequences, what happens when certain people are characterized in society, and the kind of wrong consequences, wrong conclusions that brings us to. And that's the other thing that makes this unique. It's a little different than a crime novel book in the sense that you might wonder, who are the bad guys in the book? And I think that's one of the things that separates this. For one thing, there's a long list. The bad guys in the book, the doctors are crooked, the bureaucrats are crooked, the journalists are crooked, the businessmen are crooked, the police and the prosecutors are crooked and bad. So it's that old question, the quis custodiet ipsos custodes, who will watch the guards, who watches the watchmen, that kind of question that comes up again and again. That's a larger theme in this book series. When there's an interesting article by N+1, if anyone reads that online magazine, where the writer talks about how Stieg Larsson is discussing the welfare state in Sweden. The welfare state has a certain amount of complicity in these crimes that happen all throughout these books, over decades of what happens in Sweden and happens to the characters. If you can't trust the system, who can you trust? What are you supposed to trust? The role of the state is supposed to be to take care of the individual, as the line of thinking goes, but with the corruption that's going on in the books, take care of takes on a different meaning, and more of the mafia sense of how exactly is the government complicit in these sort of things. So anyways, the point is, the villains of the book aren't necessarily just the characters, they're the institutions, or the social structures that kind of allow these crimes to happen. And I think that's one of the things that makes this book unique. It's not just a mystery novel. It's supposed to be a mystery novel with a more politically minded, politically motivated purpose to it. There's different kinds of bad guys, and therefore there have to be different kinds of good guys. So it's kind of significant, the fact that the two main characters in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo are journalists, and a hacker, a computer hacker, whose purpose is to bring information that's hidden out into the public. One of the things I talk about in the book is that this kind of writing, this sort of like socially conscious writing, is what John Paul Sartre calls committed literature. Committed literature is basically any writing that was with the intention of social commitment, any kind of writing that is supposed to advocate or inspire real change in the world. And reading these books, when reading the Girl with Dragon Tattoo books, there is a sense of moral purpose that's not so obvious in like other types of detective fiction. I mean, for the one thing, let's start with the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Like, it's a murder mystery, and as we see, it's about a lot more than just a murder mystery. Like, if you've kind of read the books through the end, at one point, I don't want to spoil too much of the book or the movie, which is coming out next week, I think. There's a serial murderer who's been committing crimes throughout the course, like over decades, and one of the questions is, like, why did this person murder people and torture people after so many years? And the answer is supposed to make your skin crawl. The murderer says, because it's so easy. It's so easy to, murder people who disappear and then never have these crimes brought to day. And I think that says an awful lot about the society that Stieg Larsson thought he was writing about. The other thing I would bring up is that, like I just said, that kind of emotional skin-crawling feeling is something we're thinking about. Sometimes when we're reading a book, like, sometimes our hearts start to beat a little faster. Sometimes our palms do get like maybe slightly sweaty. And these are real physical reactions that happen to, things that don't exactly exist. So this is kind of interesting. Like, we've all had this experience. Like, we're watching a movie or reading a book. Like, we develop real emotional reactions about something that doesn't exist. Like, these characters aren't real. These situations aren't real. Like, in philosophy, we call this the paradox of fiction. So how does this happen? Why does this happen? When we empathize with certain fictional characters, we have like an emotional connection, an emotional investment on our part. We feel fear, we feel pity, we feel happiness. We have these real emotional and psychological responses to fictional events we know aren't actually real. In philosophy, this is sort of a paradox, and this is something to think about because I think it's something that we've all experienced. And like, from a logical standpoint, it's worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about, why do we have real reactions? Why do we care about fictional characters or made-up things that don't exist? Speaking of characters, I think without a doubt, one of the things that makes the book so popular are the characters in the book, specifically Lisbeth Salander, because she's so unique. Like, in particular, she's the girl with the dragon tattoo. She's this sort of computer hacking, ass-kicking, weird, revenge-driven, antisocial loner person, but who's also at the same time, very vulnerable, emotionally and socially vulnerable. So we relate to that. We empathize with a character like that, someone who's gotten an extremely raw deal in her life, and she's the kind of protagonist we want to relate to. Speaking specifically about the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo as either a book or a movie or as a plot, it's a different sort of book. Like, at one point, it's described as, it's actually a fascinating case. What I believe is known in the trade as a locked room mystery on an island, and nothing in the investigation seems to follow normal logic. Every question remains unanswered. Every clue leads to a dead end. So the question is, one of the things I talk about in the book is what kind of book exactly is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo? It's a bestseller. It says bestseller right here on the top of the cover. And there's something to that. What I'm interested in is that there's something to that, this kind of book. What does a bestseller mean to us exactly? The experience of a book, I guess the way I think about it, and this is sort of my English background, is that reading a book is something that happens, it's a transaction that happens between us, like a reader reading books on the page. But the question of what kind of book reading and how we read it is sort of shaped by things that are outside of us. And I think this is something worth thinking about. There's a lot of cultural factors that I think come into play here that kind of shape our understanding of what popular fiction or what a bestseller is, as opposed to, say, literature. So in that sense, one of the questions that I've been thinking about this a lot, the question of what does literature mean to us exactly? What is the difference between a popular fiction book or genre fiction book and an actual work of literature? Is there a distinction to be made? Does it matter? Who makes that decision for us? I mean, for example, like this is just one book I borrowed from my library, Gravity's Rainbow. Can you judge a book by its cover? I mean, not really, no, but sometimes the cover and the outsides do tell you something. I mean, look at it, it's huge. Like, it's serious business, right? If it's actually like a big, thick book like this. I mean, obviously, no, that's not the whole point. But on the other hand, there are different kinds of social markers. Like, if you look at these types of books, and this is a Penguin version of the book, it says literature on the back cover over here. So that's interesting. Like, where did these distinctions come from about what makes a book popular fiction, what makes it literature, what makes it a mystery or a romance novel? And the answer is, like a number of things. There's no one thing that does this. Book publishers do this when they put labels like this on the book. Bookstores do this when they put the girl with the dragon tattoo like in the mystery section or the bestseller section instead of the literature section. We do that when we write critical books about, on philosophy about these sort of books. Universities do this, libraries do this, book reviews do this. It all contributes to the way that we think about these sort of books, whether they're bestsellers or novels or literature or whatever we want to call them. So it's interesting. It's a classic chicken or the egg paradox situation. Like, is a work of fiction literature? Is something like this supposed to be literature because we think of it as literature and therefore we read it that way? Or is it something that's literature only after the fact, that after we read it and then somehow it's decided that we have to, like we treat it as literature now? I mean, speaking very generally, like one of the things that I think we can say safely is there is a difference between this sort of book, like popular fiction. It's the serial nature of the book. They're books in a series. Like when you read a book in a series like this, like Twilight or Harry Potter or the Girl with Dragon Tattoo books, you're reading them horizontally. You read them quickly. They're supposed to be page turners. They're supposed to be the kind of books that you want to get to the end and find out what happens next. So you're reading it this way, you're reading it sequentially. In literature, you're supposed to be reading more vertically. Like you don't read books necessarily all the way through to the end. When you read works of literature, you're reading for depth. You're reading them, you might read them over and over again. At the peak of the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo mania, the New Yorker had a funny quote, which I thought was worth sharing. They said, we're not looking at Tolstoy here, talking about the style of Larsson's writing. And that's true. Like, we're not looking at Tolstoy, but so what? We like the Larsson novels because they're good stories. They're enthralling stories with interesting characters that are compelling. And there's something else to them, too. I think that something else is supposed to be this kind of moral seriousness, which I hinted at before. There's an undeniably blunt reality to the books. In The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, like each section of the book is prefaced with these very real statistics. One of them says 46% of the women in Sweden have been subjected to violence by a man. So the stories themselves may be works of fiction, but the crimes in which the novels are based are far from fiction, is the point I'm trying to make. So the question I threw out before, why do we feel the way we do about fiction? A related question is, why do we enjoy reading fiction that we do? In some ways, like the argument I'm making is that a good fiction, a good mystery novel is a lot like philosophy. As much as we enjoy the thrill of reaching the end of a mystery, philosophy shows us that sometimes it's about the process. It's about the thinking through of getting there that is the actual thing. It's not so much the end goal as it is what we do along the way. That's what mysteries are. Like, it's the unfolding of bits and pieces of information that we find so interesting. Lisbeth Salander says at one point, it makes it sound like she's as good a philosopher as a detective when she says she wasn't actually interested in the answer. It was the process of the solution that was the point. There's something philosophically satisfying, I think, about the plot of the detective novel, in the sense that search for answers yields this sort of like tidy resolution. Like, we have all our answers set at the end of the whatever it is we're reading. So in a philosophical sense, part of the consolation that we seek in reading fiction is this kind of reassuring sense that truth can be found. When we think about the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo books, there's questions that kind of compel us to read these things. The search for truth is really like the driving thing that motivates us to read these books. How did Harriet Vanger disappear? Who murdered Dag Svensson and Mia Johansson? Who was behind the big government Zalachenko cover-up? What did all the evil mean? So these are all like questions that have like clear, definite answers by the end of the book series. So unlike the clear resolution of some works of fiction, our real life experience, like it's true, our real life experience with the truth is never quite so neat and tidy. Like we never have like resolutions that are so cut and dried at the end of a mystery novel where everything wraps up nicely. Alfred Whitehead, one of the philosophers I talk about in the book, is he says there are no whole truths, all truths are half truths, and I think that's a good way to think about it. So I want to wrap up with a couple of thoughts, and feel free to ask any questions if you have them. When we reflect on the reasons why we would read and why we read books in general and why we would want to read The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, we might consider the following question. What does reading actually mean to us? Like, why read fiction at all? Is reading supposed to be a form of escapism? Do we do it because it's a mental break from our kind of boring everyday lives? Or is there something else? Like, do we read in order to find engagement in the world as a way to inform the way that we live our experiences? So anyways, like, these are just some questions I wanted to pose. Our hope in writing The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo in philosophy is to encourage everyone, fans of the books or fans of philosophy, to think about these questions. So I think I'll leave off with that, and then I'll turn the table over to Kyle.
This may be a loaded question, especially without seeing the movie that's coming, but how much of the philosophy do you think is at risk of being lost when they turn it into a movie and make it around 2 hours long?
I mean, that's a good question. Like, I think have you seen the Swedish version of the movie? So there are changes that sort of happen, like, I mean, I guess there's always going to be that problem with like sanitizing, like, you know, the sort of books to make it a happy ending sort of thing. So like in the Swedish version of the ending of the movie, Lisbeth has a more like active role with, you know, kind of like getting to the bad guy at the end. So there's those sort of things which make it a lot less ambiguous, which I think is the point of the book. Like, there's a lot of like moral gray area in The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. That's the point. Like, yeah, they're like good guy characters who do bad things, like, you know, kill people and, you know, those sort of things. So yeah, it is kind of lost. Like, I do worry about that, and I worry about that happy ending syndrome. Like, as an English major, I was appalled by the Pride and Prejudice, the most recent one, where they, you know, like they totally killed the ending. Like, don't see it. It's a bad movie. But like, you know, they do that. They tend to do that sort of thing. So I do worry about that. But I think it's always, Yes, it is David Fincher, so that probably helps. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, though. I think that always happens. Like, you know, personally, and this brings up another question which I think is interesting, which is, do people tend to prefer reading the books first or the movies first? Like, I prefer reading the books first, but there's an argument to be made that when you watch the movie first, you get more out of the book. You're pleasantly surprised by the things that you wouldn't have seen in the movie. So, yeah, interesting.
All right, well, thank you very much, Tyler.
Thank you.